Hi everybody, this is Katie Strand, Family Ministry Director at Shepherd of the Valley, and this video is part 2, our second installment of a Busy Parents online dialogue. Basically, reading a book that you don't necessarily have to read if you don't have time for, but I am reading Bless This Mess, trying to give you a brief synopsis as we go, and also some things for thought and reflection. And last week was the first time I did this. I feel like I tried to tackle too much, and the summary was very long. And I feel like we didn't really get to dig down as deeply as I might have liked. So this week I decided to try just one chapter. That may mean that we make our way through this book more slowly than I had thought, but I hope that each of these chapters might prove worthwhile to at least some of you. And this next one, chapter 3, is called How to Be Good. A new way of talking about goodness and badness. And in this chapter, the authors talk about the development of complex moral reasoning, and moving from a more immature, simplistic place of black and white, good guy versus bad guy sort of thinking, and moving into more of a place of living in the messy middle, in the gray area of life, acknowledging that even as adults, our tendency is to want to fall back into a more dualistic thought, but holding up Jesus as a prime example of one who pushed against that kind of thinking, this black or white. Jesus, who called into question a lot of assumptions about who was in and who was out, and in his teaching answered questions with more questions oftentimes. Told stories that did not always have a clear moral or clear right or wrong answer to them, but really highlighted the fact that real life is messy. And in this book, they talk about a few different key phrases that I want to highlight, because when we get to our question for reflection, you'll want to know what they're talking about when they use these phrases. So one is, where did it go? The myth of redemptive violence. So this is the story, they say, the story at the heart of human culture that says there are two clear sides in every clash. One all good and the other all evil. And the good side is permitted to use violence to vanquish evil. So this is a myth that is countered by a theological understanding of through our Christian faith, that is not so simple. And I'm quoting what Molly, one of the authors, used to, this was her kind of her spiel that she used for her kids, and I'm going to quote it here. There are no good guys and no bad guys. God made everything and everybody and called it good. But then God gave us choices, and none of us chooses good all the time. Everybody is a little bit of each mixed together. Some days the good gets the upper hand, some days the bad, and most of the time there is more going on than we can see. So this statement, that God made everything and called it good, God made everyone and called them good, and that we are given these choices, that we are kind of all a mix of good and bad choices, that stands in contrast to this myth of redemptive violence, that there is a good, pure good, and a pure evil, and that the pure good is justified in using things like violence to vanquish the evil. So that's one kind of term that I want, or understanding that I want us to have. Another is called the zone of proximal development. And this is when we talk about the development of children and moving into more and more complex understandings and the ability to reason. The zone of proximal development is the distance between where the kids find themselves right now and what is coming next. So it's like things that they're working on and that they need some guidance from the adults in their lives, or maybe older peers, or peers who are more mature. So scaffolding is the term for what adults can do for our children to help them move. I mean, if you think of scaffolding on a building, it's like a safety structure put in place for construction. So that's what we can do to help our kids move from one kind of level of development into the next. And we do this through the use of stories most often, both real stories and hypothetical stories, both our own personal stories and stories that we witness in the world around us, which will bring us to the question that is oh so timely for right now. The question for reflection for today is, how can we talk about a story of something happening in our world right now or recently happened? How do we talk about those with our children? And how do we scaffold them to the next level of moral reasoning? This is the question from the discussion guide that goes with the book. And notice, one thing I noticed about this question when I read it is that it's not asking how do we necessarily teach our children to be anti-racist, or how do we teach our children to do good, or how do we teach our children right from wrong. It's actually, how do we help our children move into a more complex stage of life? So rather than simplifying everything, we're actually pushing it to greater complexity. And I want to, with all humility, say that this is a question I struggle with very much. My husband and I both do, with how to talk with our kids about what's going on around us, both with George Floyd, but now with Daunte Wright, and policing, and I think I don't want to pretend to be an expert on how to talk to your kids about this, so please don't think that I'm coming to you with that. But I did find this chapter to be insightful and provide some food for thought for one way to approach talking about a difficult situation with our kids, regardless of their age. I mean, there are different things we do depending on the ages of our kids that are appropriate or whatever. So the goal here, and the follow-up question with this discussion guide, is what would you say to help jog them out of overly simplistic black and white thinking, or that myth of redemptive violence, as I mentioned before. The myth that there is a good, there is an evil. Good is justified to do whatever they need to do to vanquish the evil. And in this question it says, keep both the zone of proximal development, so where is your child developmentally and where are they on their way to being, like what's the next level of complexity, and your child's temperament in mind. And last time in the beginning of the book they talked about temperament as being kind of those tendencies that we are born with. It's more of an intrinsic, not just our personality, but kind of how intense we are or how sensitive we are wired to be, and those things can be influenced by our environment and by how we are nurtured, but it's really very much in our nature. What our temperament is our nature. It's not there's not a whole lot we can do. We can't change our temperament, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Another question is, how much would you say without it potentially being too much? And what clues would you look for that you had said enough with your children? If you, as you're listening to this, if you have had some conversations with your kids about the events of this week, or previously at other times that you would like to share, like what is a question that you have used, or what is something like a barometer in your mind that has helped you know what to say or when to stop talking about something, how much detail to go into with your own children when it comes to stories that are difficult, tragedies like the one that we are watching unfold here. And so one thing that I'm taking away from this chapter is that one of my jobs as a parent is to help process this with our kids and help them move from a more simplistic black and white view to a bit more complexity. Now, depending on the ages of our kids, that would look differently. So, for example, with young children, I'm trying to find this section. With a preschooler, they're very concrete thinkers still. And so in this case, what they talk about is that things that might seem like platitudes to us or silly mantras are actually helping construct building blocks of a worldview for them. So, for example, this phrase, "We are all good and bad mixed together," or "God made everybody and everything and called them all good." So these are, in some ways, they are simplistic phrases, although we know that those are not simple statements. But there are things that are repeatable that a child might be able to pick up on, and so thinking about what those values are for you, and being able to use those repeatedly with your preschooler. So reminding them that people aren't good or bad, but choices can be good or bad. Focusing on actions, taking actions and separating them from the worth of a person, and really helping children to understand that. And this is important. Actually, the context of this chapter is not about talking about other people. It's actually understanding ourselves. So I'm kind of moving it into really centering this on a story about other people. But it's about teaching our children that there is, being good doesn't mean that they have to be perfect, or that if they make a mistake or make a bad choice, that it doesn't mean that they're a bad person, or that there is no hope for them. There's a lot of focus on God as a God of second chances and fresh starts. The other thing in talking with preschoolers, sorry, it was a little bit of a sidetrack, but coming back to the preschoolers is follow their lead. And I've heard this before, and I think this is helpful advice to don't necessarily answer questions that they are not asking. But I like this Mr. Rogers' advice. I think many of us have heard this, to look for the helpers. And recognize that, with little children, oftentimes people like medical or police or firefighters are seen as helpers. And I think, acknowledging that, and those people are helpers, but it's complicated, right? And I think it's a little tricky when we're talking with preschoolers, because we do want them to be able to identify people who are helpers, and I think that's a good and healthy thing for them to feel safe, and then to be able to build upon that and understand the complexity that even helpers make mistakes. Even helpers can make wrong choices. It doesn't make them evil people, or again, separating out a behavior from an action. There is, and I will put this in the comments, there's another resource they actually name in here in talking to kids about policing and institutional racism. So I will put that in there for more references for you. Moving into a grade schooler, what they talk about is that moral reasoning and that development can be really tough for this age group. I find this interesting because they are, kind of in the middle between this very concrete black and white thinking and more of a middle school, high school time where everything is gray and they're pushing back on everything. That grade schoolers can often flip back and forth. And so as a parent, you might not know what you're going to get that day. They might not know where they're going to be at, that they can go from a lot of focus on what's right and wrong, just, unjust. But I think the development of empathy is huge. And so understanding and trying to put yourself in those shoes of the person who is involved in a situation, of multiple people who are involved in a situation. So wonder together about alternatives people might have had, and who might have alternatives they might have chosen if they had been given the chance. And again, kind of going back to this theme that we are loved unconditionally. We love our children unconditionally, no matter what their choices are. God's love is unconditional too, no matter what anyone's choices are. So again, kind of going back to this, like separating out the person from their actions. And so anyway, that's elementary school. Middle school talks about trying to, like in middle school, it says sometimes they can get on their high horse a little bit about like, oh, I know what's right, and why would they not be doing what's right, and kind of judgmental of the world around them. And so the suggestion is to try gently wondering with them if there might be another possible explanation for someone's behavior. So again, like pushing that empathy another step further and trying to put yourself in someone's shoes and wonder about what might be someone's motivation for doing a crime or for saying something unkind, things like that. And also recognizing that when it comes to things in life that are scary, I mean, here it references school shootings, sexual assault, hazing, mental health struggles, that they need us to be talking about it because they're hearing about it, they're wondering about it, and us not talking about some of these things that are scary and complicated to our tweens and teens, that it doesn't make it go away. It might make them actually focus on it more in some ways, and also not have the guidance that they might have from their parents. So it says at the very least, if the topic has been brought up with parents, they know that if they reach a crisis point, that their parents are a safe place for them to go to talk about it or wonder or to just be held for any kind of moral dilemma that they're facing. And then it talks about with high schoolers practicing more in-depth, like hypothetical scenarios. I found this to be an interesting thing. In this chapter, I hope I can find it again. It's they have an acronym for it. And I probably won't find it. Anyway, it's a way to walk through a scenario. Oh, here we go. Solve. So talking through hypothetical scenarios with role play. Solve, S is for select a specific problem. So be really clear. For example, your teen wants to go to a party where they know there will be underage drinking. O, so S-O, O is for options. Brainstorm as many possible solutions as possible without dismissing any as a parent. So like here, you could go, you could not go, you could go and not drink, you could go and pretend to drink, you could go and drink, all these different scenarios without saying, well, obviously this is the right choice, because you wouldn't have to have this conversation if there was an obvious right choice. So L, so S, select a specific problem. O, options. L, the likely outcome. So once the options are on the table, walk through each of those choices and talk through, like, what do you think would be the likely consequence of this one, the outcome, if you choose these different things. And again, the key is that there is no perfect option here. There are downsides to every one of these different choices. And so every choice has some good and bad mixed in. Again, you're lifting up the complexity of a decision, complexity of a situation. V is for very best one. So choose the best of imperfect options and try it out. And then E is for evaluate and debrief that together. How did it go? Was the problem solved? Did things work out mostly okay? So I think that could be done with a real problem. And the evaluation could be like, evaluate what you really decided to do and what really happened and how did you feel? Or it could be more of a hypothetical situation. But they talk about that problem solving as being a muscle that needs to stay strong. And what a great thing if they've learned that their parents can be partners in a complicated decision-making process. I mean, that's good for both those decisions that have to do with some of our greatest fears as parents, wanting to protect our kids from a bad decision. But also I think about like direction of life kinds of decisions, you know, trying to decide what college to go to or whether to go to college or what kind of career, what classes to take, things like that, where it's helpful to talk through different options that are available. Okay, I'm back after a coughing fit, and I'm hoping now that my voice and my throat will hold out until the end here so I can just wrap things up quickly. In summary, I think that one of the greatest takeaways from this chapter has to do with a way of understanding our role as parents when something sad, tragic, difficult, complicated happens in our world, in our family's life, in our kids' lives. And that is that we do not have to have the right answer all the time. Our job is less about having a good answer for our kids than it is about us helping our kids to develop a skill, the skill of complex moral reasoning. And from a faith perspective, you know, the reality is that we understand that both bullies and victims are children of God, beloved by God, that people with brown skin and people with police uniforms on are all beloved children of God. And as tempting as it is in our human nature to fall back into black and white thinking, good versus bad or good and evil, there is always more going on, and there is a lot of nuance in every single situation. And as we help our kids to have this skill of moral reasoning in a complex way, and as we help unpack these difficult situations with a perspective of curiosity and inquisitiveness, rather than rushing to give our kids answers, we are helping them develop into people who will be much more effective advocates. And upstanders is the term, you know, in a bullying situation, there's the bully, the victim, the bystander who's watching, and the upstander who stands up for what is right and stands up for someone who is being treated unfairly. And that's who we want our kids to be, right? So this complex moral reasoning is the tool and the development that helps our kids to be that, and to be mature adults, people of faith who will help make our world a more just and loving and peaceful place. And I think that is where I put my hope, that we are all raising our kids, doing our best to raise our kids with those skills. So with that, I hope that if you have impressions or comments or questions of your own, that you feel free to put those in the comments here or send me an email. And this is a really tough conversation to have in a one-sided way like this. I would much prefer to be sitting down with you and hearing from you and being able to have this as a true dialogue. And I hope that maybe someday soon we will. But for now, I hope this gives you some food for thought. Next week, we will be talking about how to fight and forgive. That's the next chapter, and so I hope you join me then. But for now, let's go ahead and close with the prayer that's at the end of this chapter. God, we are all good and bad mixed together. I know you love me and my child exactly as we are, and you also love us too much to let us stay that way. Keep growing us up in every way. Amen. Amen. Peace be with you, friends.